Before I begin, I just want to thank all the YouTubers that helped me in this video. I will put the links to their channels in the description box below. Alright, let's get started. The other night I dosed 2 caps of 2CI, 10 milligrams each. The plan was to go up to a rave, but this plan slowly fell apart over the next hour as people came through with the normal excuses of, I'm too tired or I have no money. So it seemed I'd have to spend the trip in my mate's lounge, which was fine considering there was music, a bong, a TV, and a few other good trip items. Slowly, people started going to bed, and by this time, I was tripping extremely hard, way harder than my other 20 milligram 2CI experiences. There were a few nitrous canisters around, so me and a friend started hitting these. This is where my memory starts to go, but I vaguely remember getting stuck in the NOS world for a lot longer than balloons are meant to last. I remember feeling more and more terrified as I lay and hugged my friend who was sitting next to me on the couch watching TV as normal. I was getting horrible zombie movie style gory visions in my head, and this only added to the fear. This is where it all goes wrong. I can't really remember much of the next few hours, and my only clear, concise memory after being on the couch is waking up in a hospital a few hours later with 2 policemen at the foot of my bed, as well as my best friend who stayed by my bed the whole time. Thank God for him. From what I'm told, my friend who I was with on the couch got up to make some food, and when she got back, I was pouring sweat, breathing really heavily, and screaming about how I was going to die. I then proceeded to run around the house trying to escape or unalive myself and became very violent. I remember having the thought that I'd done something terrible and everyone in the world was trying to kill me, even my family and friends, and that I needed to unalive myself quickly before they could drag it out in some horrible way. I tried to jump out of a window, was biting and scratching myself until I bled. Luckily my mates removed all sharp objects from the room. Tried to run away over next door's fence with the idea that I could somehow get away and throw myself off somewhere or something. Somewhere during all of this, a mate called an ambulance and the police turned up as well. The next thing I know, I wake up in a hospital, still tripping stupidly hard, still with the paranoid ideas from earlier. I had, however, been sedated, so I couldn't really act on my ideas except cry my eyes out. These ideas slowly subsided over the next few hours, and I became able to talk and became a lot calmer. None of the doctors, nurses, or police officers had ever heard of 2CI, and from what I can gather from their questions, they know very little about the current drug scene. From the hospital, I was transferred by a police van to a cell as I'd been sectioned under the Mental Health Act, and they needed to interview me. Luckily, I hadn't actually committed any crime. So I arrived at the police station and was told to wait in a cell until the psychiatrist was available. After a short while, he came in but was unable to interview me as I was still tripping balls. So they left me in the cell for a few hours where I had some coffee and a sandwich and lay down for a while. Slowly, the visuals subsided and they were able to interview me. After that, I was let go. After this, I've decided to quit all drugs, as the distress that night has caused my friends and family is too much for me to ever risk putting them in that situation. I smashed their flat screen TV, kicked a door down, and somehow broke the barbecue. It took 4 police officers to restrain me, and I'm covered in cuts and bruises, mostly on my hands where it seems I punched a lot of things. The worst part, however, is the worry I put my parents through that day, and the distressing night I gave my friends, as well as all the damage. One friend said after the incident, it was the single most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Luckily, the ones I've spoken to are still willing to talk to me. I'm not entirely sure what happened that night, as I've tripped hundreds of times before on all sorts of chemicals and in higher doses than this, even had some bad trips, and never have I ever come close to anything like that. It feels like I took on a completely different personality, ceased being myself and became a complete madman. It feels more like a psychotic break than a bad trip.
After an extremely powerful experience smoking DPT freebase, I recently decided to experiment with an alternative route of ingesting this novel material. My patron had also provided me with some of the hydrochloride salt, and I chose to try insufflation this time. I had inadvertently taken considerably too much of the material when I had experimented with smoking it, so I decided to be more cautious this time, laying out only 100 milligrams of the fine white powder into 2 short lines, even though I had been encouraged to try 150. After grounding and centering myself by meditating for a while, I rolled up a crisp, new $20 bill and inhaled 50 milligrams up each nostril. Thankfully, there was no burn to speak of, although as the material hit the back of my throat, I experienced some extremely medicine-y tasting post-nasal drip. I cleared my palate with a sip of a beverage I had standing at the ready for this purpose and lay down upon my bed to await the onset of effects. There was a latency period of about 5 minutes or so, after which I felt a warm, glowing ball of energy begin to form around my genital area, which became highly sensitized. This felt extremely pleasant and very erotic. Over the next several minutes, I felt the energy travel up my spine like an electrical current. Eventually, it seemed to terminate at a center in my head, and when it did so, I started to experience the full visionary effects of DPT. High-resolution, brilliantly colored images were seemingly downloaded at a frantic pace into my sensorium. The content of the visions was hard to keep up with, as the transmission seemed somewhat choppy, but there was an overall futuristic, science fiction-like theme to them. I saw outlandish images of non-human, bizarre creatures and strange, apparently alien landscapes projected onto the insides of my eyelids. Unlike my DMT experiences, there was no urgent sense of presence attached to these visions. I was definitely an observer rather than a participant in what I was seeing. I found it rather hard to stay focused on the visionary content of the experience, however, because of some rather distressing physical effects that began to manifest at about the same time. As soon as the energy traveling up my spinal cord reached my head, I began experiencing bodily shivering, which soon gave way to very forceful shakes and began to approach the level of full-out convulsions. My limbs were flailing about and my body was jerking around uncontrollably all over my bed. I tried as hard as I could to breathe through it and relax into whatever was going on, but I was pretty scared by this and couldn't escape the feeling that I might have put myself in danger of serious physical harm. My breathing became rapid and shallow, my head was whipping back and forth from side to side, and I held on for dear life, hoping that it would pass quickly. At about the 40-minute point, the convulsions gratefully subsided and the visual effects also began to diminish in intensity. By the hour point, things had tapered down into a very euphoric afterglow, with no real visions to speak of, just a nice, warm, opened-up, emphatogenic buzz. This was nearly identical to the after phase I had experienced when smoking the freebase and lasted for the next 3 hours or so. While I feel grateful to have had the opportunity to work with this rare and novel compound, I would be very hesitant to explore it further due to the extremely distressing nature of the physical side effects that I encountered during the experiment. The convulsions that I experienced were sufficiently strong to make it nearly impossible to make constructive use of the visionary state that DPT made available to me, not to mention pretty terrifying as well. I would advise a high degree of caution when working with DPT and strongly recommend having a sitter present should these physical effects happen to manifest. In my own final analysis, however, there are plenty of other materials out there that open up similar enough spaces without these distracting somatic symptoms to leave me relatively uninterested in pursuing this avenue of exploration any further. I don't know if you want me to read the rest of this stuff, so I'm just gonna go ahead and go through the rest of the page. Citation, Trey. A Rip Snortin Rough Ride, an experience with DPT. Dose 100 milligrams. Insufflated. DPT freebase. Experience year 1999. Gender male. Age at time of experience not given. Published June 15th, 2000. And I can't imagine you'd need the rest of that. So yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
I had been messing around with psychedelics for about 2 years prior to this experience, and I was very strongly craving that deep spiritual experience you read about everywhere. So much that I was willing to take ridiculous amounts of a substance just to get there. I had some experience with 2Cs, LSD and DMT before, but nothing mind-blowing to say the least. I had tried 4-ACO DMT once before, 10 milligrams, and had a very relaxing, controlled experience, but I was still missing that cosmic awakening I kept reading about. So I loaded up about 50 milligrams of 4-ACO DMT on a scale, dissolved it in some water, and swallowed it. So far so good. A little nervous, but I was sure I could handle it. I was surprised to feel it kicking in within 5 minutes of taking it. Last time it took at least 45. I started to get a bit worried, so I went online only to have it remind me that 50 milligrams was considered an extremely large dose. That got the anxiety going. Within 10 minutes, I'm sitting there with a racing heart, and I'm noticing black spots appearing all over my vision. Noticeable open eye visuals like I had never seen before. I threw on my jacket and was about to spend my next few hours outside like I had planned. Unfortunately, as soon as I stood up, I realised this was impossible. I was way deeper than I thought I would be, and it's only been a few minutes so far. This was supposed to last for a full 6 to 7 hours. I realised quickly I was in trouble and that there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. It was going to happen. I couldn't get it out of my head, and that was that. So I lay down on my bed, turned off the lights and prepared for the madness that was about to engulf me. The next hour or two were composed mostly of me trying to hold on to my sanity and remain aware of where and what I was, as I felt these two simple constants already being torn away from me. All of my thoughts were modified, distorted, pulled, stretched, and illustrated to me in immense hyperdimensional visuals too complex to describe. I was extremely afraid, mostly because I didn't know how much deeper I would be pulled in, and because I was painfully aware that there was no eject button I could pull to save myself when things were getting too dark. It was at this point that I realised there was no way to fight it, and I had to surrender myself completely. So I stopped all resistance, cleared my mind, and just lay there hoping I would somehow just pass out and wake up in the morning as sober as ever. Somewhere during this time that I was laying there, the experience peaked. Reality melted away from me completely. Hands, feet, face, body, my bed and blankets were all but a distant memory. I was just a ball of energy, floating out there somewhere drowned out in waves of energy. At a point I realised that I was dead. My body was gone. I was gone. There was just the energy that used to be me. For a while I was afraid of my death. I wanted to go back. I wanted to live. Then I realised that there was no way to go back after seeing what I saw and feeling what I felt. I couldn't fit into the world anymore. I had to be pushed out. With these thoughts, I accepted my death. Everything felt calm and silent. My mind stopped racing, and all the black and white energy around me swirled together to make an even shade of grey. It was incredibly peaceful. It's very hard to write out the experience after this time. There is a fundamental difference between knowing and understanding, and although I could attempt to make others know what I felt, it is impossible to make anyone understand. Sometime later, I realised that I was slowly coming down. It was an incredible moment of relief, and euphoria filled every inch of me. I was not out of the woods yet. At times I would forget everything I knew and become blissful and ignorant. Then I would slowly become aware of where and what I was, and I would get tired of the state I was in, and then I would slowly slip back into nothingness and become ignorant again. It was a process of rebirth that cycled over and over again, far more times than I can remember. Slowly I found myself laying in my bed, squirming around and laughing. For the first time in hours, I was able to open my eyes and saw my ceiling, which was still squirming and morphing above me. I felt my hand and raised it. It felt like it was at least a few 100 miles long. I couldn't count how many fingers I had, but just the fact that I was able to see them filled me with joy. I laughed and laughed, and after about an hour, I was sober enough to stand up and take a shower. By far, one of the most incredible and horrifying experiences of my life. Much more than I ever expected or desired.
Full-blown blackout. Clonazolam by Base Junkie. I decided to take some Clonazolam on a Sunday night to help me go to bed and relax after a long day. I started with 1 milligram sublingually and moved up in my dose over time. I remember quite fondly that I took 3 milligrams more sublingually and 1 milligram insufflated with nasal spray. The night of this experience, I remember being relaxed, but not quite satisfied with the high, which is the reason for the redosing. Eventually, I ended up falling asleep, which I have no recollection of at all, and then begins the next morning. Most of these events are from what I was told, and not things I actually recall. I was scheduled for work around 8 a.m. I had set my alarms the night prior, but they didn't wake me up. My grandma, who I was living with, had to wake me up one way or another, and immediately after waking up, I was already blacked out. I was unable to walk properly, and even one of my other relatives, who has dementia, noticed something was wrong. I was supposed to borrow my grandmother's car, as my car was in the shop, and upon asking for the keys, she denied me them and questioned my sobriety, in which case, I claimed I was totally fine and had no idea what she was talking about. I then walked outside for no apparent reason, in which she questioned what I was doing, and I simply replied, "I don't know." I then crawled back up the stairs to the house and got frustrated. I went into my room and quite literally screamed at the top of my lungs and banged my head several times against the wall. Grandma then came into my room and we had an argument which I can't fully remember the details of. A bit later, I called out of work and left a 3-minute voicemail for my manager. I really don't know how I was competent enough to get his number in this state, as it's not in my contacts, and according to another coworker, blatantly slurred my words and claimed that the AC compressor in my car blew up, which is the reason for my absence. I then texted him and claimed I had the flu basically right after, which made him mad that I claimed 2 different things. Some other things must have happened before I went back to bed. There were several call logs in my phone after calling out from work, which I didn't recognize. There are probably some other events that happened too. For example, I believe my grandmother mentioned that I went into the shower at some point. It's unknown to me if I actually took a shower or not, amongst other various degenerate actions. It's been a couple days now since this experience, and I'm just thankful that I have suffered no repercussions from this experience other than pure embarrassment from working home. I still live with my grandma and was able to play it off as if it was some kind of mental episode. Surprisingly, my manager did not mention any of this upon my return, and things continued as normal. This is probably because I work in a car dealership, and obviously, shit like this isn't the most unlikely thing to occur, albeit still uncommon. I really think I lucked out, because had my car not been in the shop, I could have drove myself to death, as I was at the time fully convinced I was sober. Or I could have made it to work and made a fool out of myself even more than I had with that voicemail. It was really lucky timing that I learned this lesson now, and not in a situation where I could have put myself or others in serious danger. Overall, I still like this drug and will continue to do it, but not at my grandmother's house, and certainly not the day before an early shift at work. I refuse to let myself have an experience like this again. Even typing this is hard, because of how embarrassing it is, and how ashamed I am of my actions. I made the foolish mistake of underestimating the potency of this drug, and suffered some embarrassment as a result. I am fortunate enough to be able to put this behind me with relatively no long-term or life-changing consequences. With time, this will fade and be forgotten about, especially considering I will not repeat these actions. It'll be like it never happened. Anyway, moral of the story is, be careful with this shit, and don't do it the day before you have to go to work.
I was at a festival camping for the weekend and we're planning on finding some LSD. It was a super small festival, and for the first time in my life I couldn't find some for the life of me. I was with my buddy and his girlfriend for the weekend. At that time they both had issues with Percocet. We were really bummed and my boy says I got that vial of DOB with me. I become instantly interested and ask him if he's tried it. He said he had tried it and it didn't work. He said he took a hit and it didn't really do much to him, so I said, well, we might as well try it. Now what happens next was one of the worst experiences of my life. The kid he got it from was my buddy's brother. He didn't know too much about it. He said there was around 8 doses in the vial. He hands me it, and I was thinking that it was really weak or something and I just had to take a larger dose. I squeezed the dropper and got it a little more than half full. Instantly, without hesitation, dropped it on my tongue. My buddy wasn't paying attention and then looked at me right as I was dropping it. The look on his face was filled with such fear and concern. I will never forget it as I spit what hadn't absorbed into my hand. It was like half a shot full. I instantly knew I had really fucked up. He starts telling me that this stuff can be lethal in high doses, and obviously I began to panic. I asked him, am I gonna die? He was like, I don't know, dude, that was a lot. He grabs the vial from me because he wanted to make sure him and his girl still had enough to get high after I basically ingested almost half of what was in the vial. We start discussing how dumb I am, and they decide they want me to do a couple 30mg Percocet. I didn't do any, obviously. I wasn't trying to take anything else. About 20 to 30 minutes passed, and all of a sudden, I start feeling a burning in the back of my neck, like right where my spine meets my head. I now knew for sure that this stuff wasn't bunk, and I could be in trouble. I started getting violently hot and had to blast the air conditioning in my car. I started going from hot to cold over and over, sweating profusely to the point where my shirt was wet and then I would get super cold, blasting the AC for 5 minutes and then the heat for another 5 minutes. Then my buddy decides he wants to do his thing and starts crushing up his Percocet. I can tell that I'm coming up very hard and it's gonna be super strong because I hadn't even started tripping yet, and I was having body spasms and shit as well. About 5 minutes after my buddy sniffs the Percocet, both him and his girlfriend puked. We were about 30 to 45 minutes into this, and I was starting to trip, so I thought it might be from the DOB, and I'm really fucked. They had taken like 4 hits after me each. I start chugging Gatorades from the back seat, trying to keep up with this constant terrible burning in the back of my neck. I drank like 6 or 7 bottles in like 20 minutes. I start to trip/roll super hard, like Blackout hard. I only remember a few pieces from the whole experience. It was a super dark trip and really hard to see anything at all. Finding the bathroom was a huge ordeal. I literally couldn't speak English anymore and would mutter these ridiculous dumb things, and I was speaking straight gibberish. I was lost in this nightmare trip for 3 days straight. I couldn't drive yet on Sunday because I was still high. I truly thought I wasn't going to come back to normal. I thought I was going to be stuck in that dumbass state for the rest of my life and be a vegetable. For 3 days I had these thoughts, truly fearing for my life through most of it. If anything, I take it as a life lesson, just a real hard one. I feel very grateful for being alive after. They say whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and I agree wholeheartedly. I believe I grew from this experience, but I probably also endured some irreversible brain damage. I chalk it up to being young and dumb. I hope somebody can learn from this experience and not have to go through that hell.
Seizures and other problems. An experience with 6-APB and MXE. This is a report about some decidedly unpleasant effects from using 6-APB repeatedly in combination with a few other substances for about a week. For the most part, we were not measuring our doses of MXE or 6-APB, we just did lines or took gel caps whenever we felt like it. Overall, we were paying a bit more attention to the MXE dosage since it's more potent than the phenethylamine. Besides these RCs, we were vaporizing cannabis and drinking. We followed this regimen for about a week, but before the end we ran out of MXE and began drinking a lot less, so that we were basically just using large amounts of 6-APB. Towards the end of this week, things began to get a bit strange. First, we lost all senses of place. The room we were staying in seemed to us to be located in a completely different building, on a different floor, on an entirely different street of the city. Even the layout of the rooms and the rest of the apartment seemed entirely new and different when we weren't occupying them. The only other time anything like this ever happened to either of us, as a result of drug use, or for any other reason for that matter, was from taking lots of Adderall, continually, for 4 days in a row. But the 6-APB's version of this effect was much more pronounced. Perhaps this was some kind of phenethylamine-induced delirium, but I shouldn't speculate. Next came the seizure-like effects. I had trouble swallowing water, my throat would clench every time I took a gulp, so it was difficult to drink anything. My wife began to experience a different sort of negative effect. Whenever she would blink too rapidly, she experienced an aura like that which had preceded amphetamine-induced seizures in the past. She had to hold her eyes shut in order to alleviate it. At the end of our delirious week, we ran out of 6-APB, and this is when the sleep problems began. The partial seizures, self-diagnosed admittedly, which preceded sleep, were the most unnerving negative effects I experienced. As I would begin to drift off, I would suddenly become very much awake, but unable to move, with a vision from the dream which had been beginning, fixed in my mind. I would be unable to think of anything else or to move any part of my body for what seemed like 30 seconds. This would happen repeatedly whenever I tried to fall asleep, for maybe 2 nights following the cessation of the 6-APB. These experiences were thoroughly unnerving, and I would not want to experience anything like them again.
Coming to terms with death. I had acquired 25C from someone a few days before this experience. Prior to this, I had experimented with one other research chemical, 2CV. I went into this experience thinking the effects would be similar to 2CV, but found something completely different and unique, and much more psychedelic. At around 5 p.m. on this day, I started by taking half of a 1 mg tab. I had it in my mouth for about a half hour. Then I started eating and realized I had swallowed the tab. After dinner, I went to a house party with a friend. It had been about 2 hours since I first put the tab in my mouth, and I was feeling minimal effects, just a little bit of euphoria. When we got to the party, I put a whole milligram tab into my mouth. I walked around the party for a while and noticed it was a lot easier to talk to people, just like on MDMA. I was feeling very euphoric and happy. This went on for about 2 or 3 hours, but I wasn't having any visual hallucinations. About 10 p.m., I went to the bathroom and flushed the used tab, then put 1 more milligram tab in my mouth. About half an hour after I put this tab in, I was seeing things that started to warp around me. It was very similar to the visuals on 2CB. Things were floating and moving slowly. It was nice, but nothing really intense. At about 11 p.m., I went outside to smoke some weed with my friends. We had rolled a really large blunt. I didn't pay attention to exactly how much was in it, but I suspect it was about 3 grams. I hadn't smoked for about a month prior to this, so my tolerance was very low. I was taking very big hits off of it and started to get very high. My friend turned on some really slow music, and it made me start to feel really floaty and trip out. This is when things started getting intense. We were outside for about a half an hour, and then I really started tripping and told my friends I had to go inside and lay down. I felt really disconnected from the world. Every time I turned my head, it was like I was seeing a brand new landscape altogether. Each direction of sight was its own world. I started to get really scared, so we went inside and I lay down on a couch in a room that nobody was in. I told my friends I just wanted to be alone, so they left. I started to see very vivid shapes everywhere. It was like I was looking at everything through a colorful grid of circles and triangles. My body started to get really tingly in certain places, and I started to twitch a little bit, like my first time smoking weed. If I stared at one thing for a long time, it started to become the only thing in existence, and I started to see it in tunnel vision. After I was in the room for a couple minutes, I started to get really scared and started thinking I took too much of the 25C. I sat up because I needed to get my head straight. Everywhere I looked was just so vivid with shapes. I stood up and walked in the bathroom that was connected to my room and went pee. I looked at myself in the mirror of the bathroom for a long time, just talking to myself, trying to come to terms with just how hard I was tripping and what was going on. Eventually I came to the idea that there was a good chance I was going to die that night. I felt very strongly that what I was feeling was what people feel before they die. I kept looking at myself thinking, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. It was extremely scary. I went and lay back down on the couch, just staring at the ceiling, which was moving around, warping, and covered in shapes and colors. It was when I closed my eyes that things got very intense. When I would close my eyes, it was like my entire body was covered in an abyss of darkness. It felt like I was not in a room in a friend's house. It felt like I was just in the middle of this black abyss. It felt like I was sinking into the blackness. It felt like I was sinking down into the earth. Then when I opened my eyes, I returned to the couch and kept tripping more. I started getting really afraid again and thinking I was probably dying. Then I started getting really paranoid about the people outside the room, thinking everyone in the house knew what I was doing and was worried about me. I started thinking people were calling 911. Every time I heard someone's voice, I thought they were talking about me. Every time I heard the front door open, I thought it was the paramedics coming upstairs to get me. I kept having these thoughts for a good hour. It was a completely terrifying experience. Eventually, I just needed to relax. When I closed my eyes this time, I went inward and looked at myself very introspectively. I felt like I was looking at myself as though I was standing inside my body, looking at me from the inside. I started becoming aware of who I truly was and what I was capable of. I started asking myself questions, but not really needing to know the answers. After that, I really needed to get comfortable and relax because it felt like my heart was beating very fast and I didn't think I was breathing good enough. At this point, time was completely non-existent. I had no concept of time, so my breathing was very hard to keep control of because I couldn't tell how many seconds were in between each breath. Eventually, I turned on a guided meditation on my phone and closed my eyes. This was the most peaceful thing ever. Between hearing this meditation and also having on the forefront of my mind the thought that I was going to die soon, it was the most amazing loss of ego I have ever felt. Shortly after this, I went to sleep. The next day I woke up feeling changed. I felt like my life had changed so much that night. I felt really good. The trip felt like it had stripped me naked away from the world and ravaged me, only to allow me to see the world as what it should be truly seen as. I would not recommend this substance to people only because it is so new and there's not a whole lot known about the effects it has on the body. However, I do feel like it was completely worth it and I have no regrets about taking the substance. Although the majority of the trip was terrifying, it was eye-opening.
December 16th, 2016. 150 micrograms, 1p LSD. I'm a 23-year-old student with significant experience with psychedelics, including a range of lysergamides, phenethylamines, and tryptamines. Just coming up on 6 years of regular tripping, close to 100 experiences under my belt. I am somewhat recently married. I'm 9 months in, and I'm midway through my master's project, facing the stress of PhD applications. The trip began fairly normally. The day before, I had cleaned the flat, taken an account of my current psychological situation so far, as I was conscious of it, and smudged a room with Palo Santo, myrrh, and frankincense in order to set the scene. There had been the ordinary pre-trip jitters and a little extra minor anxiety, knowing my wife wouldn't be about to muse upon and share thoughts with. I decided, however, to press on. My notes on paper read, "I deserve this, to relax after a long semester," and little did I know, there would be minimal relaxation to be had during this trip. Putting the 1.5 blotters under my front lip, I began my session at 10 a.m. I don't get any real alerts for the first 45 minutes, but for some reason, barely 30 minutes in and only 15 minutes after swallowing the blotters, my pupils were blown, and first effects were making themselves very much known. I began to feel a vague nausea, and my hands shook gently. I lay down and put on some music, trying to relax into the trip and flow with it. But something kept me a little on edge. Still, I consoled myself that this is how the come-up is, and put my head back to listen to the music. By an hour in, the music was causing a kind of intensified autonomous sensory meridian response, with tingles and chills running across my scalp and cascading across my body. It was not until 90 minutes in that the headspace really began to develop. However, with a myriad of questions spilling everywhere across my mind, seemingly innocuous questions like, does the house feel homely because it is our home, or is it our home because it now feels homely? All the way up to much larger questions like, how much of what we do as humans is just to elude the awareness of our mortality? The thought speed increased progressively across the half hour up to noon, until my short-term memory began to falter, and I found myself getting to some level of schizotypal thinking, where I could not fully identify myself with some of the thoughts I was having, and so externalize them into some mental presence. Whilst this projected entity was neither real nor malevolent, this was hard for me to process properly. I had some delusional notion of telepathic contact with some force outside my own mind, which, on reflection, was essentially little more than an internal current of thoughts that my ego couldn't attach itself to. By about 12:45, however, some degree of reintegration was reached, and I understood what had been happening. Still, the experience had been unsettling. I sat up and drank some water. My body still felt stiff and strained, and my jaw was tensed unnecessarily. I changed over the music, and was able, for 30 or so minutes, to drift off a little and reach some level of mental calm, though I could still feel the tension in my body. At about 13:15, T plus 3 hours and 15 minutes, my flatmate returned home. We sat in the front room for several hours, listening to the playlist that I had been listening to for the previous 30 minutes, generally conversing and messing about. There was, however, an ever-present sense of chaotic neutrality to her. I felt equal parts amused and set on edge, as though beneath this seemingly jovial interchange, there might lie the possibility of ill will towards me. This minor paranoia accompanied and went with the body tension, one increasing with the other, despite there being little sense of any casual link between them. After my flatmate returned to her room at about 16:15, the real psychoanalytical edge of the trip caught me sharp. I went down a kind of mental hole where I assessed my deepest fears. Ultimately, as some part of my mind pressed me for answers, I came to the conclusion that my deepest seated fear was that I didn't really care about anything, and that I was deluding myself into thinking that I genuinely cared about anything beyond its use to me, as a means to avoid facing mortality. It then washed over me, this existential numbness to the world, as if to show me what that is really like. In retrospect, I appreciate it was the contrast to me, the nature of that condition, with my real experience of living. But at the time, I felt like I'd cracked my facade open, and now my true nature was pouring forth. It was quite horrible. It wasn't until I heard a thought come through my head that I realized that this state of apathy was an illusion. I heard myself say, subvocally, "I wish my wife was here. I really need her right now." This snapped me back to reality, as I recalled all the sacrifices we make for one another, the sleepless nights spent worrying for one another, and the ecstatic joy I felt seeing her face on our wedding day. Like a heavy weight being lifted, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. By now, it was 1700, and I went back to my music. Though still tense and a little anxious, I was at that point just waiting for her to get home so I could hug her and tell her I loved her. At nearly 1800, she got home from a bad day at work, and I held her and tried to comfort her. It was melancholic but deeply rewarding to feel her and feel for her, sealing away that fear of all-pervading apathy. At 1900, feeling tense still, hot and uncomfortable, but with my wife happily chatting away to her mother, I went for a shower. The feeling of the cold water was like the washing away of all of the tension, a final catharsis at the end of what had been a whole day on edge to a greater, or lesser, extent. I was down by 2000, psychologically at least, though I could not physically sleep until 1 o'clock the next morning. A brief note on the visual aspects. Throughout, CEV was present and intricate, but always vaguely upsetting or off-putting, with faces and nauseating fast geometric morphing patterns. OEV were fairly tame, with decent tracing and some breathing, and limited translucent geometric forms.
The most intense visual experience possible. An experience with 2CB by Kroptkinite. Posted to Erowid.org July 16, 2001. I've recently discovered Erowid and found that the files for certain substances might benefit from descriptions of my experiences. For instance, there's a psychedelic that at Reed College, a very intellectual and psychedelic small liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon, where a student reportedly invented and first synthesized bromo in the 1960s, is called bromo or bromomescaline. I've read elsewhere that it's the same as 2CB, which I will assume it probably is. The 2CB files don't do bromo justice though, because the experience reports describe oral dosing, but bromo's true power can only be harnessed by snorting. So, over a decade ago, I was a student at Reed. My friends and I obtained some bromo from MB, a dearly departed wonderful man whom Reedies from the late 80s will recall with love and mourning. MB knew that we were all experienced acid veterans, and he knew of my propensity for taking big doses of things, so he gave us hits bigger than the recommended 25 milligrams. We'd heard about the intense pain caused by snorting bromo. Getting kicked in the face by a psychedelic mule was a common description, so we were a little wary. I was the promoter of the experiment, so I went first. I snorted the hit and told my friends it's not all that bad, and proceeded to walk to the other end of the student union to pick up a guitar. Then it started. Searing pain, as hydrobromic acid ate away my nasal passages and sinuses. Agony. S&R, having heard me say it wasn't so bad, were now snorting their doses. This is hellish, I told them, and their eager-to-trip smiles changed into expressions of fright. D, not joining the trip, watched all this with amusement. Meanwhile, I was ramping up, my body speeding and rushing, as if I'd just freebased to grab a blow and topped it off with a fat line of meth. I distractedly plucked at the guitar, and the tones sounded as if they came from far, far away. Intense rushes coursing through my body. I put the guitar down and stepped onto the SU porch. On the distant horizon, I could see storm clouds of swirling colours and shapes. The hallucinatory cloud bank was approaching with hurricane speed and increasing in velocity, coming from every direction toward me, such that I was at the centre of a rapidly shrinking circle of relatively lucid sensory perception. Along with intense body rushes, I was getting nauseous and my stomach was spasming. The storm of visuals closed in on me from 360 degrees, and at the very moment that it enveloped me, my stomach muscles clenched hard and I projectile vomited, sending my dinner 6 feet across the porch onto the grass below a nearby tree. Now immersed in the most intense visuals that I've ever experienced on any psychedelic, and I've done almost all of them, I saw my spout of vomit as a luminescent stream of gorgeous rich colours and rapidly spinning, rapidly ever-changing geometric shapes. I was humbled and awed by my vomit's beauty. The pain from the snort now seemed like a distant memory of an insignificant triviality, its intensity dwarfed by the intensity of the swirling tornado of intricate visuals that I was now experiencing. I can't even begin to describe it, so I won't cheapen the visual experience by attempting to describe what cannot be put into words. I returned to the student union, and although I was literally almost blinded by visuals, I could make out the image of S&R holding their noses in pain. This is unbelievably beautiful, I told them. No amount of acid could ever produce visions like these. Remarkably, There was very little head trip, so I could loosely and rationally and calmly contemplate what was happening to my sensorium. Despite the relatively slight head trip of the sort that psychedelics normally produce, there was a deeply spiritual aspect to the trip. I could strongly sense the presence of Mescalito, or whatever entity had overseen my peyote and mescaline trips in the past, and who was never present for acid or mushroom trips. 6 or 7 hours later, S and I had returned to our group house and went for a walk in the neighbourhood, smoking a fat one of the kind Northern Lights indica. The intensity had passed, and we felt like we had almost come down. Now the visuals are down to about the equivalent of 6 or 8 100 mic hits of acid, I remarked. Or maybe 10, S replied. Although I've taken hundreds of psychedelic trips, I never did bromo again. The one extremely intense experience was far enough for me. But my life was never quite the same after that night. I recommend snorting bromo only to experienced and intrepid psychonauts. Others should consume it orally, which causes effects more comparable to mescaline or acid, or maybe not at all.
Well, this is an update to my experience of the drug Ephenidine, which pretty much killed me from my point of view. In my last trip report, I said I took 2 grams of the substance by mistake. I didn't intend to do that dose because it was too high. Luckily for me, I'd built up tolerance in that experience, especially as I was home alone. This time, I was kind of down as my partner told me she was going to commit suicide one day, so I left her in bed, ran downstairs, and stupidly, without measuring the substance, took a large amount, around 1 to 2 grams using a tablespoon. I really wasn't thinking straight. I wasn't intending to commit suicide or anything, I just wanted to chill and have fun. Usually I would dissolve 1 gram in 100 milligrams of water and use a syringe to titrate a safe dose. This time I didn't. Very stupid and dangerous. Next, I put on some music and started to meditate. It must have been 15 minutes later, I don't know, but the next thing I remember is banging into a door upstairs with excitement. I wanted to share a cool secret of some sort, something to do with the Matrix. I don't even remember walking, just falling. I was thinking, what the fuck? I don't know what's happening here. My girlfriend rushes out and asks what's wrong. At this moment, I became lucid and unaware that I was foaming at the mouth. I was still talking about the block of power in the Matrix. She wanted to phone an ambulance. I didn't want that, so I somehow ran down the stairs, hid my stash, then ran back up them, and the next thing I knew, I awoke in the hospital in the ICU with tubes inserted into my penis and other tubes connected to my arms and machines. I was placed into a chemically induced coma for 3 to 4 days as none of the benzos would calm me down. It took 2 police officers, 2 security, and other members of staff to restrain me. It was hard enough dragging my ass to the hospital as I had been delirious. It's bizarre how I remembered none of this. I was in a very serious condition. It was as if I had a PCP overdose. I remember nothing at all. My behavior was okay until I saw people who looked like police, and I guess subconsciously became defensive. The hospital took my girlfriend into a private room and told her I was probably going to die. This must have been horrible for her as she didn't know if she should tell my parents. She did let my brother know. To me, that day I died. As the lights went out, I remember thinking, I hope my family is okay. Then everything went pitch black. I then woke up. I wasn't surprised. It was as if I had expected it somehow, remembering on a subconscious level. 4 days in the hospital and tubes up your dick is not fun. When I returned home, I flushed all 25 grams of the material to never touch it again. I love drugs, but I'm not going to risk my life like that again. It's an interesting substance, but it's also very dangerous, and it can lead to redosing or mistakes. I would dose low and make sure the stuff is out of reach and avoid mixing with other substances just to be safe.